Thank you, Shira, for this great interview. We move now to a panel on the future of Lebanon. Over the years, Lebanon has had more than its fair share of misery. But it seems like the last 2 years have been the worst. Political deadlock, economic crisis, poor governance, a terrible blast in Beirut, and of course the ongoing COVID pandemic. All these have created a terrible situation for the Lebanese population. The international community has been largely absent, leaving Lebanon to deal on its own with its problems. In this panel, we will try to see if Lebanon can rise from its crisis, if there is some way in which Lebanon can solve its problems. We are joined by highly knowledgeable panelists. The first panelist is Tony Bdran, a research fellow from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, the FDD. Born and raised in Lebanon, he follows very closely the situation there. Our second panelist will be Atkes, an economist. Before joining INSS as a senior fellow, he worked at the Bank of Israel, and he will address the economic situation in Lebanon. Our third panelist is Orna Mizrahi, who served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Foreign Policy before joining the INSS as a senior fellow. She's in charge of the Lebanon file at INSS, and she initiated this important panel. We'll start with Tony. How would you describe the current situation in Lebanon?
Well, good morning from the US to you all, and I thank you for having me today. The way I would describe what has been happening for the last 2 years in Lebanon is a conditioning process on the part of the ruling oligarchy, basically, or the sectarian consortium in Lebanon, which is dominated by Hezbollah in its totality. After the rise of the popular movement in October 2 years ago, the October movement, there was a lot of feeling in, both in Lebanon and abroad that this actually is a movement to change the system. What has happened is actually the opposite. What has happened is that the pillars of the system have conditioned the population to basically accept all their losses and redistribute their losses and to basically not challenge the status quo. And that's what you see. So on the part of the population, there is a complete resignation to their situation, and those who can leave have left. So you have, in that sense, the end of the post-Civil War lie that had basically dominated Lebanon since 1990. And the lie was that after the Civil War, you can come in and rebuild Lebanon and start something new. And this was how the sectarian leaders attracted the expats of the Lebanese who had left during the war, as well as their capital. And that meant that there was a constant influx of foreign currency into the country, along with the aspirations that soon became complicity on the part of these expats in basically sustaining the status quo of the system, until it all fell apart. A next lie is now going to be reborn with the complicity, of course, of the international community, what's so-called the international community, the United States, France, and so on, in order to basically sustain the new status quo, which is actually what has been the reality that people have been trying to ignore for the last 20, 30 years, which is that the Lebanese political system and the social makeup, its demographic, the pillars of its strengths, or rather the pillar of power within that system, belong to Hezbollah and to the Shia community. Some countries abroad, like France, have completely come to terms with this and have offered explicit partnership with Hezbollah in Lebanon as the new ruler of the domain. The United States plays a more coy game, but with the same result. It just does it indirectly. It does it by elevating a fiction that there is something called a state in Lebanon with institutions. And this way it can indirectly sustain a system that is run by Hezbollah. But now I think that's the trajectory of where we're going, sort of the end of a phase of the post-Civil War and post-Syrian withdrawal in 2005. Its collapse, conditioning of the population to accept the collapse and accommodate themselves to it, whether by leaving or by staying. And also an accommodation or conditioning of the international community to this new reality, which, like I said, both the United States and France appear to be willing participants. The one change is that, unlike what had happened in the post-Civil War era, Saudi Arabia has decided that it does not want any part of this game. So Saudi Arabia has cut its losses and told the Lebanese best of luck and moved on. So I think that if there's any change from what we had seen in the past of how this scenario unfolds, is that despite tremendous pressure from the United States and France, the Saudis have said enough is enough.
Thank you for this. Hagai, we know the economic situation in Lebanon is very bad. What are Lebanon's main economic problems?
The problem started with the relatively low exchange rate, foreign exchange reserves. In order to sustain the influx of foreign exchange and foreign currency, they engaged in some sort of financial engineering. So in addition to what Tony described as the political atmosphere, there was also an economic incentive to send money to Lebanon. And actually, Lebanese banks gave higher interest rates on deposits of foreign currency than investors could have got in other places. As a result, and this was particularly true in the environment of the low interest rate in the last decade. Since the outbreak of COVID and the decline of tourism and the decline of arrival of expats to Lebanon, we see a decline in the reserves of foreign currency in Lebanon. And Lebanon tried to fix it very quickly after it got an allocation of SDR, an asset by the IMF, and they sold the SDRs in exchange for foreign currencies to bolster the situation. This is part of the problem. The other part, as a result of this financial engineering, the financial system is basically bankrupt. And there are a lot of losses, and there is a need to decide how to distribute the losses between various actors. And actually, Tony mentioned it, that the elite wants to make the population to bear the burden of the losses rather than the elite themselves. And it's also related to the situation of the central bank, that its situation is unclear. The international community, including the IMF, pushed the central bank to undergo an audit. They're doing some sort of audit, but now it's not clear whether this audit is moving forward, how well it will be done. And the last thing is the fiscal situation. In order for a state to operate, it needs to control its borders and ports and so on, and be able to collect taxes. And this is not the situation in Lebanon. There are a lot of fiscal leakages, both in tax collection and also in tax spending. Some of the spendings are not going to the right directions. They are embezzled by various groups. And this will be also a challenge for the donors, how to provide aid to Lebanon without allowing these funds to be embezzled by various actors.
Thank you for that. Orna, how does the dire situation in Lebanon affect Israel?
Well, I will start by saying that it's affecting Israel. It is affecting Israel now, and it's going to affect Israel in the future. And I think that it is a very important issue for us that we have to deal with it. We can't neglect it. We can't push it aside and say it's not our business. I think that what is going on in Lebanon is our business, and we have to do something about it, at least to deal with it and formulate some kind of strategy of how we are dealing with this issue, and we can't continue to be focused only on the military threat to Israel by Hezbollah. We have to see what's going on in Lebanon because it's connected. The threat from Hezbollah is connected with what is going on in Lebanon. Now, I know that not everyone in Israel agrees with me. And I think that even Tony, I'm not sure that he agrees with me that there is something to do about what's going on in Lebanon. I think that Lebanon is not yet controlled completely by Hezbollah. And there is something to do. In Israel, there are two main approaches toward this issue. There are some that are saying that it's fait accompli. Lebanon is under the occupation, even occupation of Iran. Hezbollah is leading and deciding about everything that's happening in Lebanon. We call it Hezbollah state. And I even heard some voices in Israel that are calling it Hezbollah-stan. I think that it's not the real reality that we are witnessing. It's the way that you are looking at it. There are two reasons that they are bringing and saying that why it's, Israel has nothing to do with it. The first one is that, there is nothing to do because it's fait accompli and you can do nothing about Lebanon. The second one is maybe the situation, but the deterioration of the situation, the inside situation in Lebanon is good for Israel and is playing in favor of Israel because now Hezbollah is dealing more with what's happening inside Lebanon and is less free to act against Israel and invest in confrontation with Israel. I think that it's not the reality because I think that maybe today he is busy with what's going on inside Lebanon, but we are going to have a greater problem in the future, and we don't have the privilege to, as I said before, to put it aside and not deal with it.
So if we'll elaborate this issue a little bit, so how can the situation in Lebanon improve, and how can Israel assist Lebanon or assist the international community in assisting Lebanon?
So, Galya, I'm not naive. I'm a little bit optimistic, but I'm not naive. And I know that it is going to be very difficult to improve something in the devastating situation in Lebanon. But I think that we have to try to do something. Not we Israelis, because Israel cannot do a lot by itself. They ignore us when we offer our help. They see us as an enemy state. But I think that Israel can do by joining or motivating our partners in the international community. I'm talking on the same partners. It's United States, France, and also the partners in the Gulf. Our new partners in the Gulf, and the Saudis through the Americans, to create some kind of coalition that maybe can do something to change the situation in Lebanon. I know that we need billions of dollars to help Lebanon, and there is a need to a profound change in the system of Lebanon, the economic system, the political system. And it can be, we cannot do a lot in the near future, but I think that at least we can stop the deterioration of the situation. So in our annual assessment that was just published last week, our recommendation was to the decision makers in Israel that to motivate, to act with our friends and to motivate them to do something. We are talking about the need of a common strategy and the need of that this strategy will include dual policy. On one side, to help the voices in Lebanon that are the anti-Hezbollah camp, because there is an anti-Hezbollah camp in Lebanon. There are voices, parties, and these voices are becoming more and more loud about the fact that Hezbollah is the problem of Lebanon, about the fact that they don't like what Hezbollah is doing with Israel. They don't like the influence of Iran. So we have to see how we help these voices. The anti-Hezbollah camp now in Lebanon is very weak, but maybe we can do something to strengthen them. And the other thing, on the other hand, what is needed is to continue with the pressure on Hezbollah, to continue by all means, military, economy, political, cognitive warfare. As we are doing for a few years, we have to continue with that and to try to change the balance inside Lebanon between the pro-Hezbollah and the anti-Hezbollah section, and in the region between Iran, the Iranian influence and the Western and Gulf and the moderate Arab countries' influence in Lebanon. Because I think that Israel's interest is that Lebanon will be stable, prosperous, and because chaos in Lebanon is bad for Israel. We have seen in the last year that because of the deterioration in the situation, that Hamas could have be stronger in the south of Lebanon and even started to fire rockets again against Israel. So the chaos is no good for us. And we have to think about ways to change the reality.
Thank you. Tony, do you think Hezbollah will allow the creation of the conditions for an improvement in the economic situation in Lebanon, in the political situation in Lebanon?
I think Hezbollah has no problem with an improved economic situation. You see, the conventional wisdom has it that outside aid to Lebanon somehow is bad for Hezbollah or counters Hezbollah or upsets Hezbollah. It does not. Hezbollah is more than happy with external aid. In fact, Hezbollah encourages external aid to the Lebanese army, to the economy. It has absolutely no problem with that. The issue in the past has not been that of aid. It has been that now, today it's been whether that aid requires systemic reform. And in that case, it's not really just Hezbollah that's blocking systemic reform. It's everyone, because Lebanon is not a real state. Okay, it's a money laundering headquarters. Its entire banking system is completely enmeshed with Hezbollah illicit activity and others, starting from the central bank all the way to the smallest bank that got sanctioned by the United States, in 2019, Jamal Trust Bank, for instance, very small bank. So, you look at the Al-Qard al-Hassan financial institutions, the records that came out of it, and you see, every Lebanese bank is part of it, and that's it. Because that's what, when we say Lebanese economy, okay, the Lebanese economy is money laundering. That's what it's been from the 60s. It's not a real place. Hezbollah has no problem with aid. Hezbollah has no problem with, Saudis putting money into Saad Hariri, because Saad Hariri was a junior partner for Hezbollah. No problem. It has no problem with the United States putting money in the Lebanese armed forces, because that means now the United States is more invested in Lebanon and is looking to micromanage some of its basic day-to-day operations. You look at the ambassador in Lebanon, and she's acting like she's the director of Électricité du Liban, or Amos Hochstein, coming, and he wants to, run their energy sector. And it's kind of ridiculous. But Hezbollah has no problem with any of it. So the issue then again is how the outside world decides to work and cooperate with these parameters, meaning no systemic reform. You deal with what is. And what is whatever has been there forever, and now with Hezbollah at the helm. Emmanuel Macron, for instance, has said, yes, absolutely. I am here to deal with Hezbollah, no problem. That's French realism, and so no problem. So, and I mentioned that the United States is doing it through the illusion, or at least the stated objective that somehow this is going to counter Hezbollah. But in fact, they're just stabilizing the situation, which means stabilizing the Hezbollah-run order. So stability, which Orna just mentioned, is not a problem for any of these actors, Hezbollah included. They have no problem with stability under Hezbollah, no problem. And the Hamas thing is an example. Hamas, I mean, you know, we haven't heard of that in a long time. It happened very specifically within an Iranian context because it was Hezbollah managed. It wasn't against Hezbollah. It was Hezbollah managed. So the idea of chaos in Lebanon is also a questionable proposal. I'm not quite sure. You know, a lot of people talk about, we can have a return to the civil war. I don't know. I don't know if that's actually true. I don't even know if chaos, in the sense that we understand it, like for instance, like a Somalia scenario, which a lot of people talk about, or an Afghanistan scenario. I don't think that's true either. I think, there could be violence in Lebanon. Of course there could be violence, but there are multiple levels of violence. There are different types of violence. Is this violence that can actually shake the foundation of the system as it is? I'm very doubtful, at least for the foreseeable future, specifically as it pertains to Israeli security. The threat to Israeli security from Lebanon is only from Hezbollah. It's not from anything having to do with, some form of other violent actors coming in. If they do come in, it will be under Hezbollah and Iranian management, not against it.
Thank you. Chagai, if you were the head of the Lebanon portfolio in the IMF, what would be your recommendations for the international community, for the regional actors? How can they assist Lebanon?
Well, okay, so actually last Monday, the negotiations between the IMF and Lebanon were resumed. So it's a timely question. I think the international community, including the IMF, should set very clear conditions to Lebanon in order to get an aid by the IMF and the other actors, and be able to reform its economic and, in a way, also it's a political system. So first of all, the need to address what Tony mentioned, the money laundering system, and do audit to the whole financial sector, starting with the central bank. The Central Bank of Lebanon has awkward set of assets, including the National Airways, Middle Eastern Airways, and a casino and other things. Not many central banks have these kind of assets. They have other kind of assets and liabilities. All these issues should be clear, should be evaluated, audited, and we should know, the international community should know whether this bank has any positive assets at all. The same thing goes for the commercial banks. All the commercial banks should go through audit to see whether they're underwater or above the water, and debt of the financial system should be restructured, and the losses should be allocated to relevant actors, not only to the weaker population. On the fiscal side, Lebanon should be able to strengthen its fiscal management, starting with true collection of taxes from all economic actors in Lebanon, and also be able to spend money in a reasonable way without significant fiscal leakages. And this is, again, goes back to the donors. If and when they'll provide aid to Lebanon, they should make sure that as little as possible is being this aid will leak outside of its intended targets. And we have a recent study dealing not only with Lebanon, but with aid in general, that significant part of the aid is going to tax havens after aid is being given to a country. So I think this fear is particularly acute in the case of Lebanon. And the other thing is being able to bolster their foreign exchange, their foreign currency reserves. without doing financial engineering or providing too generous tax havens for foreign investors. So they will not start this game altogether.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of the panel. Orna, looking ahead, a few years ahead, how do you see the future of Lebanon?
Well, it's very difficult to see the future of Lebanon, but we always think about few scenarios that can happen, and most of them are not so good because, as I see it, it's very difficult to change the situation if nobody intervenes from outside. Anyway, one scenario is that there is going to be another civil war. Another one is that Hezbollah will take over completely and will lead Lebanon completely. The third one is continuous of deterioration. The only optimistic one is about the possibility that some kind of help from outside and also from inside, from the leadership of Lebanon, will come and maybe we'll start some optimistic direction to change what's happening in Lebanon. I'll conclude with a simple message. I think a simple message to the decision makers in Israel, and I think for the leaders in the international community. The message is: don't give up on Lebanon. Don't let Lebanon fall completely in the hands of Hezbollah and Iran, because this is the very bad scenario that we are seeing here in Israel, and I think that this is what everybody has to be afraid of, and we have to be more proactive. We have to have some common strategy to see how we can help the population of Lebanon without letting Hezbollah taking this assistance and putting it in its pockets or into its advantage. How we can strengthen the opponents of Hezbollah in Lebanon and to continue with the pressure on Hezbollah.
Hagai, your concluding remarks.
So I would like to conclude with three comments. One is optimistic. In a way, this is a horrible economic downturn. It was termed by the World Bank as one of the three worst economic collapses in the last since 1850 in the world. But this crisis took place without a war. So in a way, no capital was destroyed. The bridges are there, the roads are there, the hospital is there. So I hope that with a change in the system, perhaps economic recovery could take place much faster than in the case after wars where you need to rebuild the capital. The pessimist comment is we are facing a change in the financial situation, in the global financial situation, and interest rates are likely to go up, particularly in the US, but also in other countries, other leading countries. And Lebanon is deeply with debts. So increase of interest rates are bad news for all countries with large debt, and particularly for Lebanon. And the last comment is, I'm trying to think about the situation that Tony again describes, that Hezbollah is actually took over Lebanon, and now it's not what is called in political science a roving bandit. It's a stationary bandit. So if they want to increase their benefits for themselves from controlling Lebanon, they should be able to push for development of Lebanon, which could also benefit other actors, not only Hezbollah itself.
Thank you. And Tony, the last words are yours.
So I think the situation is going to continue, the system is going to continue to limp along. The system in its current incarnation, meaning a Hezbollah-dominated system, the rise, if you like, of political Shiism under the domination of Hezbollah, that's going to continue. The country is going to continue to limp along as it has been for the last 2 years, and more likely the desperation of outside actors is going to win out, and except for the Saudis, I don't see the Saudis coming in, and that is the right decision, by the way. I mean, they understand, they are the only ones with the realistic assessment. The French are going to continue to rely on the United States to provide capital, and the United States will continue to provide low capital. So that will help Lebanon continue to limp along the way it has been for the last 2 years. Now, that is the irrelevant part, because domestic Lebanese dynamics are really not important. What is going to make a difference in how what comes next with Lebanon and certainly within Lebanese-Israeli relations is if the United States does conclude a deal with the Iranians the way we are seeing it in the trajectory that we're seeing, which means that there's going to be a lifting of sanctions, which means that there's going to be enriching of Iran, which also is going to obviously trickle down to Hezbollah one way or another, which will help, incidentally, Hezbollah manage to get the country to limp along and to perhaps even consolidate its explicit partnership with France and its unofficial partnership with the Biden administration. So that, of course, presents a different dilemma for Israel, because an unleashed Iran, then Israel has a decision whether it coexists with that or if it takes preemptive action. Of course, I don't presume to talk about that, but that is that will become the decision point. And of course, it will become a military issue, and that's the bottom line, because the political dynamics of Lebanon are not really of any relevance to anyone except for the Lebanese themselves. So I think the fork in the road is going to come once the Biden team and the crew from the Obama team conclude what they had started in 2013 and 2015, and sort of relaunch this realignment, as I've called it, with the Iranians. And that, of course, is going to be the most meaningful change in the sort of geopolitical dynamics affecting Israel moving forward.
So thank you, Tony. Thank you, Chagai. Thank you, Orna. I'm joining Orna with the message of don't give up on Lebanon. אנחנו נצא עכשיו להפסקה, ואחר כך נדבר על מדד הביטחון הלאומי. תודה רבה.